Hi, William. How are you?
I'm fine, Neha. How are you doing?
I am great, and thank you for coming on for the interview. I wanted to start right off the bat, talk about your new book, The Rigors of Angels. It picks three specific personalities, very reputable in their own fields, and like kind of connected but not, and like also like philosophers. It's like there's so many philosophers. Why did you pick this one specifically? So can you give me a brief on why them, what's the connection,
It's a
and
great,
then
it's a great question.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's a great question. In fact, I had the idea for the book, which developed over really a quarter century of thinking and teaching and reading and writing about the topics. The topic was there for long before I settled on these particular three thinkers. What happened was I needed to find the right vehicle. And at the beginning, I sketched out a very expansive notion for the book that ended up, it would have had probably a similar number of chapters, but each of those chapters would have been devoted to a different thinker from a different period of time, going back as far as Zeno of Elea and coming up to as far as probably Heisenberg and Einstein would have been the last couple of chapters. All of these characters ended up in the final version, but I needed something that would be more of a coherent through line. And I wanted to find characters who would be compelling, whose lives would allow me enough material, there would be enough information in their biographies that I could use the craft of narrative nonfiction to bring the audience along on a story of philosophical discovery. The other thing that was extremely important to me was that because I am a humanist who loves science and philosophy and literature, I wanted to have my approach to the fundamental problem of how the human being encounters, makes sense of reality, be approached from three radically different fields. So I really wanted a scientist. I wanted, some kind of a scientist. I wanted a philosopher, and I wanted someone who was deeply involved in words and poetry and language. And then I realized, in thinking through this as I was wrestling with, well, who could these three figures be? I was also, I have to admit, deeply influenced by the structure, the idea of the great Douglas Hofstadter book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, from a good 30 years ago, which had also taken three completely different people, in his case, a musician, a mathematician, and a pictorial artist, and brought them together to tell a story. This would be a completely different story, the one that I was telling, and yet this I really was attracted to that idea of weaving together figures from different fields. And then I was reminded that about a decade or more ago, I had published a little piece. It had Borges in the title, but it was really about these three thinkers. And it was in the New York Times in their philosophy forum called The Stone. And I went back and I said, there they are. It's Borges, it's Kant, and it's Werner Heisenberg. And it was just the briefest sketch of the ideas that would eventually come into this book. But the impact and the importance of each of those thinkers was there. And I said, that's it. This is what I have to do. And then I just, fell into a long-term project, several years of reading much more in depth about not only their work. I mean, in the case of Kant, this was someone I'd studied extensively. And in the case of Borges, I've been writing about him for years. Heisenberg, I really had to do a lot of work on to catch up with. And so I did. I studied the quantum mechanics. I delved into his biography. I read his writings. I knew that there were a lot of other physicists who were going to be part of the story that I was telling. So I was reading about them and great stories about their interactions. And I read a lot. And Einstein ends up being sort of a secondary force. How could you tell the story without
Mhm.
reckoning with Einstein? So a lot of reading of Einstein's own work. None of this was necessarily completely new. I'd been teaching in my teaching. I would teach texts by both of them, but especially texts by Einstein. I had taught relativity for humanists for many, many years in one version or another. So I was ready and really wanted a platform in which I could also use my skills as a storyteller, what I hope are my skills as a storyteller to help convey the complexity and beauty of Einstein's theory of relativity as well. And so this was another, excuse that this book offered for me to be able to do that. But that's how that ended up being these three characters and why they came from such different perspectives.
But why the rigor of angels? That's a very,
The rigor.
yeah.
The Rigor of Angels is a quotation, actually. It comes from Borges, from the end of an extraordinary story by Borges called Plurn Uqbar Orbis Tertius. And it's a story about a vast conspiracy theory that is woven by sort of a small army of intellectuals over several centuries. The purpose of which is sort of not just to create an entire country and culture, but ultimately to create a planet, and to do it in all of, to out of intentionally build every possible system that would be involved in a whole new species of life. So new mathematics, new religion, new mythologies, new languages, new ways of seeing the world. And what Borges says, he writes this extraordinary and kind of eerie postscript at the end of the book, and he makes it a proleptic postscript. So he pretends that he's writing from 7 years in the future from when he's actually writing. And the narrative voice, who is Borges himself, reports back to us from a world that has been destroyed by this idea. And that he says ultimately in explaining it in this postscript. So this voice, which, as you can kind of imagine, is walking through this post-catastrophic landscape, reports back, and he says, in some ways, reality had to crumble. It crumbled because of the force of this idea, because humans forget and forget again. There's rigor in the world. They can find rigor in the world, but they forget and forget again that it is a rigor of chess masters and not of angels. In other words, that the rigor that we find in the world, be they scientific laws, ways of explaining the world, are always constructions necessarily of our own reason. And it's important for us to recognize that they are constructions of our own reason, because when we make the mistake of thinking that they were planted there beforehand, that their rigor is not us, not made of the rigor of chess masters following rules, but it is a rigor planted there by some prior being or greater being, that leads us into what Kant would call fanaticism, fundamentalism. It leads us into ways of interpreting the world that are not only ultimately going to be scientifically wrong, they're also going to be politically dangerous.
So you speak about Kant, and then you also speak about Jorge and his ideas. What is the story that you were trying to tell through them?
So the story is the story of hubris, of people, scientists, philosophers, theologians, who have failed to recognize the limitations of human reason and have bumped into problems of their own making, if you will. And also the story of these three particular, why are they heroes? Well, they're not heroes because they were great men. They're not heroes because they were particularly ethical. They were all deeply, deeply flawed in kind of marvelous and interesting ways. And at the same time, they're heroes in this story because their philosophy, their literature, their science was all about recognizing the inherent limits to our knowledge. And in so doing, actually coming up with better literature, better philosophy, and better science in the end.
You discuss in the book the fascination of paradoxes by all three of them. How do you see the interplay between paradoxes and antinomies and the exploration of reality in their works?
So why they have this fascination with, and here we can, I think, for the level of this conversation, kind of use antinomy, which is Kant's specific word for a kind of paradox, and paradox interchangeably. But what they each realize in their own way is that precisely by making the mistake of failing to realize, to use Heisenberg's formulation, that when we do science, we're not actually taking a picture of nature itself, right? We're taking a picture of nature as it reveals itself to our instruments of knowledge, our instruments of science, our ways of knowing the world. Our scientific picture of the world is ultimately a scientific picture of the way that we picture the world. And that's it seems like a very technical, and ultimately it's an extremely important distinction, because when we fail to do that, when we allow, to use now Kant's terminology, reason to overstep its natural limitations, well, there's going to be signs. that we're doing that. And one of the signs is that we will fall into paradoxes of certain kinds. And Kant was the most systematic in designating what those paradoxes look like. And he got them from the history of philosophy. He got them from going back to people like Zeno of Elea, who accompanied Parmenides in his debates with Socrates, and who left impressions of the way that that thinking incorrectly about the world would lead to paradox. He left them in the Platonic dialogues, traces of this sort of mistaken thinking. And Kant, I think, very, very systematically came to a realization as he was in the long process of writing what would ultimately be the most important book of philosophy of the last millennium, the Critique of Pure Reason, that form of mistake, that form of paradox is a reminder to us that we've made a category mistake in thinking about the world. And for Kant, this was a very specific one, that we have allowed reason to overstep its bounds, that we've used the tools that are intended to analyze, explain the phenomenal world, a world extended in space and time. We've used it to try and look at all of existence without as if it were not measurable in space and time. And that's where the paradoxes that he calls antinomies come from.
And then what do you recommend from like, the analysis of it all? I know it's almost like over analyzing itself is the issue here.
Yeah, I think what one recommends as a result is humility, is caution, is analyzing one's own position first, right? We're living in some strange way in an age of critique, in an age where everyone says they can do their own research, where everyone says, doubt what's being told to you. But what is seldom, I think, really analyzed is that the way this is conveyed, this kind of sense of critique, of doubt everything that's told to you, is in fact the most hubristic, non-humble version of that mandate. Because basically it's saying, ultimately, don't doubt yourself. Don't doubt your intuition. Don't doubt what you already believe. Whatever you've swallowed to this point, that's ultimately true, and you can doubt everything else around you. This advice, if you will, that's channeled through these thinkers is exactly the opposite. This says, no, first and foremost, doubt your own certainty. Hmm?
Where
Where
do
did
you
you get this idea? Hmm?
where do you think that humanity has somehow lost the plot then? Because again, these great thinkers and philosophers are saying, maybe have some hubris, and we don't seem to have that as a collective.
And you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the examples that I'm trying to bring to this is how easy it is to fail to see that. And because there's other great heroes in this book, Einstein, I have nothing but the most extraordinary admiration for him, but he was also led astray by this, what, to use Borges's term, this belief that the rigor he found in the world was the rigor of angels. And he even used theological language that, Niels Bohr would eventually have to say to him, will you please stop telling, dear God, what to do with the world, right?
Hmm.
You don't know that. But Einstein felt sure that he was. When Einstein, and he felt reaffirmed on many occasions in 1919 when he got the news, and he was sitting with a graduate student, I think in Berlin, and he got the news that the Arthur Eddington expedition had confirmed his experimentally general relativity to the exact degree with the curvature of light around, but through gravitational lensing. The graduate student said, well, you don't seem very surprised. What if you had been wrong? And he said, I would have felt sorry for the dear Lord. I mean, so he's a marvelous and funny character and absolutely brilliant beyond compare. But if even he can, in a sense, suffer from the kind of hubris that assumes that everything has to bend to your will because that's the way it must be out there in the world, because reality is a certain way, as opposed to these are the tools that we use to analyze something called reality, and they're potentially going to change, and they're always up for revision. Then my goodness, if he could fall to that temptation, no wonder that we constantly need reminding.
You have briefly mentioned in your book the story of Solomon. How does his experience with memory relate to the broader themes of memory, perception, and the nature of reality in your book? Can you
You
first
mean
like, yes,
Shereshevsky,
yes,
the Russian journalist?
yes.
It's a fascinating story, and I begin the story of Solomon Cherishevsky, who was a Moscow-based journalist in the 1920s, in part just because of the wonderful happenstance that I'm telling a lot of these stories, at least the 20th century, the science stories, and Borges' story, precisely in the 1920s. So the book begins in 1927, as Heisenberg's on the verge of coming up with what would eventually carry his, be his most famous theory, the uncertainty principle. Um, but it's around the same time that Shereshevsky, this journalist, gets kind of called in to his boss's office and gets upbraided for not seeming to care in meetings. He's not taking notes. He doesn't seem to be paying attention. And Shereshevsky looks surprised and he says, "Well, why would I need to take notes?" And the boss says, "Well, to remember what I'm telling you to do." And Shereshevsky says, "I know exactly what you told me." And then he proceeds verbatim, without missing a single word, to recite back to his boss every single thing that was said in that meeting. And the boss said, "Well, this is nuts." So he sends him to have his head examined, essentially. And Alexander Luria, the great neuroscientist, sort of one of the fathers of the field, as a young scientist in Moscow, was one of the first to start, testing him. And he says, after several weeks of testing, he says, "I've actually come to the conclusion that there are no limits to this man's memory. He can remember absolutely everything." And why I tell this story, in part, is because of when it's happening, but also because it inspires Borges to write a story several decades later, or not even, like a decade and a half later, if at most, that is at the beginning of the collection that will ultimately launch him into world fame. And that story is called Funesta Memorias, and it's about a man who has an accident, and as a result of his accident, loses the ability to forget. And what Borges so beautifully, in his very Borgesian way of taking a situation and then pushing it to its absolute extreme in order to examine our fundamental assumptions underlying how we think about, for example, perception, memory, knowledge in the world. He demonstrates that, far beyond the question of analyzing one particular man and memory, he demonstrates that our very idea of knowledge as a kind of picture of the world that can get more and more in focus and more perfect is fundamentally flawed. What he demonstrates is that if you have someone who can't forget, it's exactly the same thing as having someone who can't remember. If you have someone who can't fail to perceive absolutely everything, it's exactly the same as someone who can't perceive anything, because our very knowledge of the world depends on at least a minimal distance, a minimal slippage, a minimal blurring in order for us to actually have knowledge of anything, which means necessarily, by virtue of its very basic components, knowledge must be incomplete.
Hmm.
And that idea that knowledge must be incomplete, that Borges conveys to us logically through storytelling, is conveyed philosophically in Kant and conveyed scientifically and experimentally in Heisenberg's work.
I might be completely reaching on this idea, but would it make sense that evolutionarily humans are meant to forget? And also that kind of humbles us so that we keep on looking for more information or learning. And that is in itself a design, not a flaw.
I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. A creature that that somehow didn't forget. First of all, I would say, from my perspective, is in some sense absolutely impossible, because knowledge of any kind, if you're not God, some sort of a notion of an omniscient being who isn't affected by time whatsoever, then any kind of a being that has knowledge, any kind of performance of a measurement in the world requires distance from what's being measured by definition of what it is. And that distance is going to require fallibility of some kind. But to build on your point, most certainly what is the case is that beings have to evolve in ways that the errors that they make sense. In essence, that there's a self-correcting mechanism that we build on our not only our knowledge of the world, but our mistakes about the world. In some kind of beautiful sense, evolution is sort of a mistake. It's an engendering machine built on a history of mistakes, right? Of trial and error. That's what
Hmm.
mutation is all about. Change and adapt. change and adapt. And that's why I think it is, in fact, Darwin's theory is an absolutely beautiful model for how knowledge works. And because built into it, baked into the very idea of progress is constant error, constant error. Mm.
Your book touches on Heisenberg's political engagement during the Nazi regime. How do you interpret the relationship between his scientific brilliance and his seemingly cautious political stance during that time?
No, I do, and I say, look, it does. What this should also tell us is that being cautious scientifically, which Heisenberg definitely was, can have very good benefits in all sorts of ways, but it's not like a panacea. It certainly
Mm.
didn't help him make, if you will, the right decision. If we look back in history and we see Einstein, who was radical in his denunciation of Hitler and gave up his German passport and was emigrated to the United States and brought his knowledge with him, as did so many other Jewish scientists. Or Schrödinger, who was not Jewish and hated the Nazis and left and went to Dublin. History looks more kindly on them. In fact, I've had people, it's an interesting historical debate about the intentions of Heisenberg, whether he, in fact, sort of scuttled the what would have been a potentially productive nuclear program under Nazi Germany, or whether he simply, was what did he was called by some of his interlocutors, like Samuel Gutschmidt, referred to the smug Heisenberg clique in Germany that were just so full of their own brilliance that they didn't do the hard work that the Americans did. This is a huge debate right now, right? And the idea being that, I mean, the example that I was just about to give, someone I know I get very, very nice comments in general about my book, but someone who was writing me to say, look, I really enjoyed this, but ultimately Heisenberg was a Nazi. And someone else, within a week was also writing me and saying, you give too much credit to the Heisenberg was a Nazi theory. He really was doing so much to undermine the efforts of towards weaponization of nuclear. We don't know. That's the point. We really don't know. It is a robust historical debate right now. But, there's no question that Heisenberg comes out with his hands a lot dirtier in this debate than people who cleanly cut the cord and left Germany. So, that caution, if in some sense, that wait and see attitude that I referred to probably didn't serve him that well in this particular case.
But don't you also agree that sometimes the truth is a lot more murkier than it seems? We might be
Yeah.
like, there are so many layers to each decision that a human being makes. And then when you look at it from a further away lens with lesser information, which is when we do forget things, that does affect what judgment we make on somebody else's decisions or actions. And that same way historically, everything that we have seen throughout history, be it empires crumbling in front of our eyes, and we're like, this was the final, that straw that broke the camel's back. But it could be a lot more than that, and we're missing a lot of key factors.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And this is one of the points I'm making towards the end when I talk about the moral judgment that we cast on historical characters. And I make the point that I think in a very beautiful and also humble way, an older Samuel Gutschmidt, whose own parents were killed by the Nazis, and he was furious at Heisenberg. He was also furious at Heisenberg. Heisenberg had attempted from within Germany to intercede. His letter had come too late. Who knows if the Nazis would have paid any attention? Quite frankly, he was very suspect already under that regime, and they weren't paying much attention to him anyway. But he tried. His letter came too late. Gutschmidt's parents went to Auschwitz. Gutschmidt, stood at Auschwitz after the war, weeping over at the place where his parents had been killed, murdered, and he blamed Heisenberg in part. And at the end of his life, after a long debate between the two and public exchange of letters and acrimony, Heisenberg died, and Gutschmidt ended up writing his obituary for the Times, and really said, and ultimately he was a brilliant and good man. So he came to a completely different conclusion at the end of his life, and I think adopting that kind of humility basically not only humility towards what we can know in science, but a humility as far as what can we know about another's heart and their decisions, you know?
You mentioned that when we choose what we observe, we insert our freedom into nature. How does this concept tie into the idea that we are active participants in the universe we discover?
Yeah. So that idea also has to do with what's called today the anthropic principle. And the anthropic principle is one of the ways of dealing with what is often referred to as the fine-tuning problem. So, you know, you look at the extraordinary laws of physics that we've discovered, and then you start working your way backwards as a cosmologist would do, because you realize the universe changes over time, that it's growing, and so you dial everything back and you try and get a picture of the universe at the earliest moments. And then you have to sort of decide, well, what changes, you know, if the fundamental laws of nature were somewhat different, if the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force were tuned to this degree instead of this degree, and then you start playing with those, you realize, well, that wouldn't have worked out very well for us. This would have created, you know, a universe that consists of exclusively black holes, or this one would have been such an even universe that mass and matter never would have come together. There wouldn't have been planets. That wouldn't have worked out very well for us. And so people start to play with numbers and say, my God, the chances that the universe exists the way that it exists right now are astronomically slim. So what could possibly explain that? And one answer is, well, God, he must have just sort of created it the way that it is. And that's the, you know, that's the universe according to intelligent design, which is sometimes known as the strong anthropic principle. Then others come along and they say, well, no, this is not a convincing us. We don't want to kind of pull God out of the gaps in order to explain everything. But if universes were being birthed all the time in every possible way, if nature was just trying out different kinds of combinations of physical laws, and we found ourselves living in the kind of universe that would support our existence, that's sort of not as surprising, right?
Hmm.
That would make sense. So if you imagine kind of infinite universes, and we just happen to find ourselves in one of the very, very few that supports human life. I mean, one of the examples, I don't remember, I've used it as a book. I think I used a different one. But if you're a blade of grass out on a golf course and you get hit by a golf ball, you can say, what are the chances? Right? Well, yes, but if it's just the golf ball hitting some blade of grass, the chances are pretty close to 100%, right?
Hmm.
So that's the difference between those two. What I come down on is very different in this book. I say, why do you think it's necessary to be calculating these chances in the first place? It sort of has the nonsensical ring to it of saying, wow, out of the 8 billion people existing in the world right now, how lucky I am to have been born to be me. Well, no, you just are you. And there was no one prior to you floating up in the sky that was part of like an 8 billion slot roulette table that you could then say, this makes a lot of sense. This is what I refer to as, when we then do these calculations, we insert the freedom, namely that you are here in this now, and you always have to make your choices and your paths from this particular point in time. We sort of try to erase that. And yet at the same time, when we do that, we install that freedom somewhere else, namely outside of space and time, at the beginning of the universe in some way.
Do you think that maybe like us human beings who have this need and this like urge to understand, and given the fact
Mm.
that we don't have the answers, God almost plays a placeholder for us where we go like until we figure it out, it is quite possibly random chance or God or
Mm.
any, creator of it
Yeah.
all, because otherwise it does not make sense.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what scientists or some scientists or philosophers, people who think about these call, like I'm quoting Marcelo Gleiser here, but I think got the term from elsewhere as well. I think it's existed for a long time. The God in the gaps argument.
Hmm.
Uh, so science gets so far, it comes to a place where it doesn't understand something, and it says, okay, there's God, right? So
Hmm.
we'll let God be there for a little while until you back
Yeah.
up. But no, we've explained that now, and then you say, no, well, God's over here, right? Because there's
Hmm.
always going to be a gap. Of course, which very much agrees with Marcelo, my approach is to say, no, the gaps are inherent. You're not going to get rid of the gaps. So you don't need to put God there. You just accept that knowledge it comes with necessary gaps. And those gaps are always going to mutate, always going to change. So you're not going to find like the ultimate gap either, because finding the ultimate gap would kind of be like finding God. Mm.
Your work spans literature, philosophy, and science. How do you approach bringing these disciplines together? What challenges and rewards do you find exploring the intersections in like each different field of study?
Yeah. So that I guess the challenges are what you would imagine would be in some ways the obvious challenges, right? It's it's enough work to master one discipline, so you kind of need to extra work in it to learn more. I guess I was fortunate in that I found my way to, my field is really literature and philosophy. I got ultimately I did an undergraduate in comparative literature. I did a master's in Hispanic literatures. Then I did a PhD and another master's in comparative literature. And the field where I did my comparative literature degree was really continental philosophy, intellectual history. So the interplay between literature and philosophy is something that I always done. But before became interested and before I trained, starting as an undergraduate in literature and philosophy and languages, I was really what we would call in the States a math and science nerd. So that's, what I did was physics and math, to the point where in high school I was, taking my bike to nearby community colleges to take math courses. And in fact, by sheer coincidence, and I wish I'd been told at the time, one of the kinds of math that I had to study outside of high school because I didn't have it in high school is linear algebra, which a version of which Heisenberg developed in order to create the matrix mechanics that he defined in 1925 as the basis for quantum mechanics. But so there was a lot of math. And probably I have a mathematical way of thinking, most likely. It's sort of deeply ingrained, and always this abiding interest in theoretical physics, math, astronomy, and cosmology. So I kept on coming back to it. One of the earliest papers that I published in the Journal of the History of Ideas in the 1990s. I was still in graduate school when I published it in that journal, was about the problem of the shape and ultimately potentially curvature of the cosmos in Dante's Paradiso, which is something that had been written about by mathematicians and scientists. It required reading Einstein. It required going back and looking and understanding Riemann's four-dimensional mathematics, non-Euclidean geometry. So that was work that I've been doing all along. But yes, the big challenge is to do it well. I think there's a sort of minimum level of facility that one needs to develop in a variety of different fields. And so if I have a special calling card, I guess that's what it would be.
And how do you see the themes in The Rigors of Angels resonate with contemporary intellectual and cultural conversations?
I think one of them has to do with the impact for the relevance for our current political situation. As I kind of said at the beginning implicitly, but I think one could say this explicitly as well. This is a book that inveighs against the kind of thinking that would allow people to be wrapped up in conspiracy theories and the sort of hubristic attitude that I think is really generated and fostered by our social media environment right now, which is one that the answer because you know the answer before you ask the question.
Hmm.
And the approach that I'm constantly developing is no, you ask the questions and you keep on asking the questions, and ultimately you really need to question yourself and why. What's the desire structure? What makes you desire to find the answers that you come up with? And this is something I write about in a different vector of books. A couple of books that I've written with my good friend and colleague David Castillo, including Mediologies in 2016, and then What Would Cervantes Do in 2018, are really about what is called post-truth culture, post-truth politics, and I think there's heavy overlap and overlay between, if you will, the ethical impulses of The Rigor of Angels as a book and the ethical impulses in those books as well.
So how do you see this story continuing? Because right now it does look like, that we are in the age of over information and it's just keeps on coming. But there was a time where it's like, there were few media channels, it's like it's trusted sources. They have been like, rigorously checked before, like, that information is shared. Now that like, that protective cover is gone. And it people look at, like, Instagram pages, or, like, the visibility of a website. If it's got this number of views, it's probably correct. How does this story continue? What's the next chapter looking like?
My God, we have to get to a point where we realize that the media ecology that we're stuck in right now is just driving us to further fanaticism, further divisiveness, further error. There has to be a retrenchment of some kind. There has to be a return to fundamental principles of checking evidence, of asking that self-critical question before one presumes the critique of others, and only grasping the error of our ways is going to lead us to that. And so there are those of us who are kind of shouting out, up, from the top of the hilltops, if you will, trying to get the voice out there. That is really, we have to check this tendency. But as far as I can tell right now, it's only getting worse. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to, it doesn't mean that I and David Castillo and so many other people who are trying to get this message across aren't going to try. We're really going to continue trying. But with the rise of artificial intelligence, it's going to get worse. We need checks and guardrails on artificial intelligence. We need to require, ultimately legally, that everything that's generated by artificial intelligence identify itself as such. Be it in language and large language models, or in image generation, everything we need to inscribe these in law. And thank goodness the Europeans are usually ahead of us on this. In the United States, the European Union has just voted on kind of groundwork legislation in that regard, whereas in the United States we're still the Wild West, because we do tend to let corporations do what they want. And as we just saw with the recent shakeup of OpenAI, if a board really tries to rein in a company's, its guiding principle
Mhm.
is the bottom line, guess what's going to happen? The board's not going to win.
Hmm.
Yeah.
As an author of multiple books, including the one that we've been discussing, what insights or personal reflections have you gained and delved into in like, in general across the board, and also specific to this book? Like, the amount of research and your body of work, the philosophers and scientists that you refer to, I understand, like, you can't condense into one theme, but there could be a
Right.
few things that, like, of course, jump out for you.
I think you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. First of all, there can't be one through line, because there's too many different ones at work. But if you will, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it took me so long to write The Rigor of Angels, and why it really was, at least at this point in my life, it's sort of my ultimate statement to the world. Is I think that implicit, explicit contrast between Borges's two ideas there in that one sentence. The rigor of angels is a beautiful phrase, but it's a negative one, right? He's offering us a cautionary tale. It's between, recognizing that the rigor you find in the world is a rigor of chess masters, and recognizing that there's a rigor of angels. That's a lesson that, when it hit me when I read that book, that's what he was saying. And then I reflected back on the story and what was happening in the story, and I saw that this is a book about this is a story. It's a story about what happens to us in politics. It's a story about what happens to us in religion. It's a story about what happens to us in science. I guess that would be the closest thing to a through line, is this idea that, remember that the rigor we find out there is not really out there, that we are responsible for it. And in so doing, develop a certain humility, respect uncertainty. Mm.
Something that you briefly just said, responsibility. I feel like that
Mhm.
is something that has been thrown out of the window, where you go, like, these are my rights, this is what I deserve. We live
Yeah,
in that world. And when it comes to, like,
deeply. Yeah.
us as human beings, what we should be doing, what will help us as a civilization, that is not taken seriously. Do you think that the lessons that nature will teach us because of the consequences of this would be, let's just say, scary, to say the least?
Yeah. Nature is teaching us some scary lessons. There's no question about it. And it is, I think you put it very nicely. It is about responsibility. It is about, recognizing that it's not happening to us. we're out there doing it to ourselves. And as you're implying right now, and I couldn't agree more, it has absolute consequences in the realm of climate and environment. So that's part of that story as well. This is not happening to us. We are not victims in some sort of a pure adulterated say. We are self-victimizing, and we are victimizing each other. No doubt about it. We are exploiting and sifting between those who can protect themselves in the short run, but only in the short run, and those who are suffering the immediate consequences of those who didn't care and didn't take responsibility. Very, very, very important message to make.
What are you working on right now? What interests you? Are there any specific live projects that are like in the pipeline?
So in the pipeline, January 11th, a book on the surrealist filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky who is coming out with Bloomsbury's Philosophical Filmmaker series, and that's a book that is largely about Jodorowsky's art, but also his practice of his healing practice, which he calls psychomagic. And I use a psychoanalytic framework to analyze and sort of enter into conversation with Jodorowsky's practice in that book. It's intentionally a shorter book. It's not as long as The Rigor of Angels, about 160 pages as opposed to 400. But it's something I've been working on for a time and really have enjoyed. Something in a completely different vein, if you will. And then long term, because I always have to have something that I'm working on long term. I've just started talking to people about the brand new project, which is I'm tentatively calling working title, which will change eventually, De Anima, so borrowed from the Latin version of Aristotle's On the Soul. That will be with a sketched out subtitle of the search for or the search for intelligent life in animals, machines, humans, and beyond. So the idea there is so much of the current concern around generative AI
Hmm.
has been about the possibility of machines taking over humans with their agency, with decision making. And I'm asking, as a cultural historian, intellectual historian, the question of, well, if we back away from the current fixation with specific modes of what we're calling artificial intelligence and ask the question, what have different cultures in different times presumed about specific nature of the human, presumed about the specific nature of intelligence? Will those vocabularies and those questions help us see more clearly what we're actually asking when we ask questions like, can machines think?
What do you say to the school of people who say that AI or the way that we're progressing is just the way that evolution is meant to happen, and that either we get on board or get abandoned?
I would say there's an implicit presumption when you say evolution is meant to happen in a certain way. That's actually not how evolution works. Evolution was not meant by anything. It's blind, and it could be that it goes one way, it could be that it goes the other. Evolution is not an ethical framework. It does not show us a way. It is simply the way things change. So sure, that could be right, but there's no destiny to it. We need to grapple with where we are in the here and now and say, is this a future we want? Is this not a future we want? And I would say right now, what we most need to do is to understand what we are creating, to grapple with it, and to use the means at our disposal, which are law, policy, our reason to decide what the limits are and what is acceptable. We've done a really, really bad job so far with massive interventions into the world in the form of what we've done to the environment and climate. I think we're on a pathway to do just as much damage with artificial intelligence if we don't watch it.
The thing is, unfortunately, they're not leaders or people who are policymakers who think in this way. And I don't feel like it's happening anytime soon. It's the way it's going, it's about making profit,
Of course.
trying short-term gains. It's
No,
like you said, it does not look pretty. But not wanting to end on this note, where can people find your work?
just to accentuate what you were just saying, and to quote another great thinker was also influential for me. Although I think he got it from somewhere else as well, and I can't remember. So my attribution right now is limited. Slavoj Žižek once said, again, probably quoting someone else, and thinking about massive catastrophe movies, that it has become easier to imagine the end of civilization, the end of the planet itself, the end of all life, than it is to imagine a simple change to the structure of capitalism. And there's a reason for that, right? Capitalism doesn't want us to change.
Mhm.
So, because there's a profit motive, and it's working just fine for
Hmm.
those who are reaping its benefits. We just have to keep on, being loud and doing our best. And where one can find my work is honestly pretty much anywhere. If you Google it, you'll find it. The books are out there. My most recent book is with Pantheon. The one that's coming out in January is with Bloomsbury. Previous books have been both with Bloomsbury, with Columbia University Press, with Stanford University Press, and others. And I write in the New York Times. I write in the LA Review of Books, among other places.
And for someone who's just been introduced to your work, where do you
Mm.
recommend they start?
I would say The Rigor of Angels, that
Perfect.
book. Mm.
Perfect.
That's where I would suggest that they go. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Neha. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed our discussion.